mind to aftersight and foresight, let me disclose the gifts reserved for age, to set a crown upon your lifetime's effort. First, the cold friction of expiring sense without enchantment, offering no promise but bitter tastelessness of shadow fruit as body and soul begin to fall asunder. Second, the conscious impotence of rage at human folly, and the laceration of laughter at what ceases to amuse. And last, the rending pain of reenactment of all that you have done and been, the shame of motives later revealed, and the awareness of things ill done and done to others harm, which once you took for exercise of virtue. Then fool's approval stings, and honor stains. From wrong to wrong the exasperated spirit proceeds, unless restored by that refining fire, where you must move in measure like a dancer. The day was breaking. In the disfigured street he left me with a kind of valediction, and faded on the blowing of the horn.
All right, now for many readers of this poem, of Four Quartets, this section, two things, is some of the most disturbing and difficult language lines they've ever read. Like, what in heaven's name is going on and what's being said? Others have said, and I think this is because they understand these lines, that this may be some of the most amazing stuff that T.S. Eliot ever wrote. Let's take a look now, and let's go to it. Now, right away, I want to study, starting with lines 56 to 79, I want to study the opening line's structure. Did you see it? 3 stanzas, each 8 lines. Each of them have rhymed couplets. Do you see it? Sleeve, leave, suspended, ended, house, mouse, despair, air. Many have said that there's a kind of almost an eerie type of ringing mantra-like about this repetition. Here we're going to see the 3 faces of death, right? The death of air at line 63, the death of earth at line 71, and of course the death of water, fire at line 79, right? Let's work through these lines and try and figure it out. Notice we begin with the word ash. Now, quite literally, and this is true of all these poems, but it's certainly true in Little Gidding, every word has a both literal and, of course, a metaphysical or a metaphoric or a symbolic meaning. Ash here, literally, T.S. Eliot, his job was to actually be kind of like a night watchman and to kind of watch. And he's out walking, and the bombs have hit a neighborhood, and there's ash still floating down in the air. Of course, we're familiar as well with this notion of how ash is a symbol of a number of things. Again, going back to the comments that we made about Ash Wednesday, an important Christian poem of T.S. Eliot's. Ash on an old man's sleeve, old men ought to be explorers now comes to mind, right? Is all the ash the burnt roses leave. And notice again that we're back to roses, and now they're burnt roses. Dust, well, there's been a lot of dust, like there's been a lot of fog. Hover through the fog and filthy air, the final lines of the first scene of Macbeth 1:1, playing the same game. Dust in the air suspended, back to that notion of being between, right? Marks the place where a story ended. I mean, think about that. If houses can be destroyed, as we saw in an earlier set of lines, right, for a poem, then here we're playing the same game. When war kills, stories end. It's a compelling idea, right? Notice we're back to dust. Dust inbreathed, back to that wind in unwholesome lungs, was a house. And again, we're back to this notion of East Coker, line 2, of houses can fall, right? The wall, the wainscot, the mouse. We think about Blake's mouse, don't we? The death of hope and despair. This is the death of air. Bert Norton, of course, emphasizing air, right? At line 64, notice it's not here, but it's there. There are flood and drought. Over the eyes and in the mouth, right? The idea here is that we'll have now, it's just like permeating you, the dust, it's everywhere. It's getting in dead water and dead sand. Now we really are in wasteland language, aren't we? Of course, water is the dry salvages. land emphasized, of course, in East Coker, contending for the upper hand. And then the parched, eviscerate soil. Again, soil, fascinating study. Just look at the last words of each of the four quartets. The word soil, as we pointed out, the last word of Dry Salvage is in here. Nothing's going to grow in this soil for a while because of this stupid bombing, right? He says the parched, eviscerate soil gapes. We've already pointed out that T.S. Eliot, if you're going to be a good poet, you really got to pay attention to your verbs. Notice this word, gapes at the vanity of toil. Vanity, Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Laughs without mirth. Now, we're going to come to this. I think that standing behind a lot of this is Shelley's To a Skylark. We look behind and after and pine for what is lost. Our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. That notion that the harder we laugh, it's because we're actually sad, because we know we can't be happy like we are right now forever. Here we are with laughter. Takes us as well back to the children's laughter, doesn't it, of Bert Norton at the very beginning. And then this is the death of earth, of course, earth being emphasized in East Coker. Water and fire succeed the town, city, the pasture and the weed, country, nature. Water and fire deride, what a wonderful verb, the sacrifice that we denied. Here we are now, back to Dover Beach. The sea of faith was once to it the full, and round its shore lay like the coals of a bright girdle furl. Now I only hear its long withdrawing melancholy roar. We used to be able to believe Dover, Matthew Arnold says in Dover Beach, but we just can't do it anymore, and we're on this darkling plain, right? Certainly lines are being echoed here. The sacrifice that we denied. Water and fire shall rot the marred foundations we forgot. By the way, just go over to line 114, and there we're at forgetting again. T.S. Eliot was aware that St. Augustine basically argued in his theology that the only sin is to forget. When you sin, you are forgetting in some way, right? Forgetting, of course, whose you are and God's that you belong to and all of that for St. Augustine. The marred foundations we forgot. You could make the argument that this is the critique of modernity that T.S. Eliot is wanting to make. Lips that would kiss form prayers to broken stone, he says in The Hollow Man. We talked about those lines. The marred foundations we forgot. Of sanctuary, we're actually talking about Little Gidding as a church, aren't we? And choir, there are those voices, those singing voices. This is the death of water and fire. Of course, water, Dry Salvages, and here fire, Little Gidding, right? Well, as we've said, we've got all kinds of different types of death that are being described here. The death, spiritual and, yes, physical, right? But notice, to die spiritually with water, baptism, fire, the Holy Spirit, in Christian theology, right? Before you die physically, allows you to have no fear about your physical death, right? At line 80, then, we will turn to the second part. Now, this is one of those really strange parts that's significant because it does stand out, lines 80 through 151, as something quite different. I mean, this is the only time in all the four quartets, for example, that somebody from the outside enters into the poem and says anything. Okay, so that alone makes it significant. Who is this somebody that enters, and what is it that this somebody has to say? Well, I think that as well is going to be important. By the way, we know that Eliot himself, for those of you that were challenged to read this, we know that Eliot himself struggled with these lines because he wanted to somehow mimic what Dante does in his Divine Comedy with his three-line Trisarima, where he will follow a rhyme scheme of A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, C, and that's his challenge through these lines. Well, let's study them, and let's see what happens. In the uncertain hour, again, we're back to that fallibilist position, before the morning, near the ending of the interminable night, that notion of being between. At the reoccurrent end of the unending, after the dark dove with the flickering tongue had passed below the horizon of his homing. This is a dark, ironic image. Doves are usually birds of peace, as we know, right? Think about line 202, where we'll see doves again. But notice here, what we're talking about are the planes that are dropping bombs, right? The flickering tongues had passed below the horizon of his homing, while the dead leaves still rattled on like tin. It's an amazing simile. And we're going to come back to it again at line 89. Line 85, while the dead leaves still rattled on like tin, over the asphalt where no other sound was, between three districts, line 87, again we're playing this notion of between three districts, could be three English neighborhoods, could be a referencing to Dante's Divine Comedy of Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. You can read it either way. Whence the smoke rose, we think of the fog and the smoke. In other words, at the time of the evening, of the early morning, when Eliot is out, the pilgrim, is out walking, and the smoke and the ash and all of this is happening. He says, when that was happening, he says, I met one walking. And we think about that line in Wasteland, you who were with me in the ships at Miley, has that dog you planted sprouted? All of those kinds of things, right? Or Stetson and all of that, right? I met one walking, loitering, and hurried. How can you be both? The paradoxes. As if blown towards me, like the meadow leaves, back to the simile at line 85. Before the urban dawn wind, unresisting. In other words, I look up, he says, I thought I was all by myself, and I look up, and there's somebody coming at me. Which is kind of freaky, right? I mean, think about how Horatio responds when he sees the ghost of old man Hamlet, same kind of thing. I look up and he says, and I fixed upon the downturned face, we think of Dante immediately in the Inferno. That pointed scrutiny with which we challenge the first met stranger in the waning dusk. T.S. Eliot probably literally had this very experience of walking in some bombed out area and all of a sudden seeing someone, and that someone maybe doesn't want to look up and is looking down. I caught the sudden look of some dead master whom I had known, forgotten, half recalled, both one and many. In the brown-baked features, the eyes of a familiar compound ghost, both intimate and indefatigable. Now, this question of who is this person has sent lots and lots of scholars, running all over the place trying to figure it out. There's all kinds of interesting lists. One obvious one is the great poet W.B. Yeats, a pal of Eliot. Eliot, however, said that he didn't really want for anybody to read this as Yeats because he didn't want to imagine that he was putting Yeats in hell the way Dante, for example, will put Brunito Latini from the Divine Comedy in Inferno, book 5, down in Canto 5, down in hell. Some have said that this is a combination of all of those great writers that he was referencing in earlier lines that he knows he'll never actually, match up to or meet up with. Okay. The brown baked features remind us, of course, of the brown river of the dry salvages as well. So, line 99, he says, I assumed a double part and cried and heard another's voice cry, what? Are you here? I want to pause to make two observations. In many ways, this assuming a double part is what T.S. Eliot has been doing throughout the entire four quartets. I began in my comments in that intro lecture by suggesting to you that T.S. Eliot is very much between two wars, caught in the middle, that tension. And here, I think this double part, there's two T.S. Eliots. There's the Eliot, just like there's two Dantes. There's the Eliot that's writing this poem, and there's the Eliot that's a pilgrim in this poem. And here we have that the kind of the two, right? The second thing I want to say is, I think this is the question of the poem. What? Are you here? Notice the significance of the word here. We've pointed out how important it is in terms of location vis-a-vis our study of prepositions in these poems, right? That's the question of all questions. Of course, it also takes us back to our study of Genesis 3 and Milton's Paradise Lost, where you'll remember that God will ask the fallen Adam, after he's eaten of the forbidden fruit, along with Eve, remember, ask two questions. Where are you? Because Adam is hiding. And what have you done? Two of the most compelling questions of all of the book of Genesis in our study of that, right? Here it's, are you here? I didn't expect to see you here, sounding very much like those lines from Inferno 15, right? Although he says, we were not here. In other words, this is a ghost, a compound ghost. I was still the same, knowing myself. Think about our Socratic line from the Delphi Oracle of Know Thyself. Yet being someone other, and he, a face, still forming. Notice the power of the use of the word still here. Can have two meanings, right? It can have positional meaning as well as another understanding of still, not moving, right? Yet the words suffice to compel the recognition they preceded. And so, compliant to the common wind, too strange to each other for misunderstanding, in concord, they are somehow together. At this intersection time, we think about the last words from the last lines from the last section, right? Of meeting nowhere, again, line 55, England. No before and after, we trod the pavement in a dead patrol. So here we go. We're going to have a conversation with two people walking. He says, I was out walking doing my job because that's what I had to do during the dropping of the bombs on London. And all of a sudden I look up and I see this person and I'm like, what? Are you here? I didn't expect you to be here. And so I decided I would have a conversation with him because it was clear that we got on together with each other. Okay? And so he has this conversation. Now, I said, line 110, I'm helping you to know how to read this poetry. I said, the wonder I feel is easy, yet ease is cause of wonder. In other words, I'm kind of shocked that I'm not surprised really to have you here, and I'm kind of surprised that it's so easy to want to converse with you. Therefore, speak. We think about those lines from Wasteland. I never know what you are speaking. Speak, speak, right? Speak. I may not comprehend, may not remember. Now, of course, this just takes us to all different parts of the earlier four quartets. The idea that words move, that whole notion that we never can quite figure out exactly what's being said. He said, I may not understand what you're saying. I may not even remember what you're saying. Of course, we're back to that critique earlier of how we forget the past. At line 113 now, we're going to have whoever the he is. Whether it's Yeats, whether it's Dante, whether it's Shakespeare. I mean, the list just goes on and on. Now we're going to have him speak, and he's going to talk now for quite some time. In fact, he's going to go all the way to line 148. So whatever is being said now is this alter ego, compound ghost, whatever you want to call it. And these are some compelling lines written by by T.S. Eliot, the poet. I will possibly slip several times and call Eliot Dante at this point because it's just so easy to do it. Echoing the lines of Brunetto Latini in Inferno 15, he says, I'm not eager to rehearse my thought and theory, which you have forgotten. And we're back to this notion of forgetting. These things have served their purpose. Let them be. And sounding a lot like the final lines of Hamlet, right? Let it be. So with your own, and pray they be forgiven by others. The lines that you've written, maybe, the deeds that you've done. I pray you to forgive both bad and good. Well, I mean, this takes us, here we are now, back to so many different conflated ideas. Earlier he said, I know you're probably not even, the speaker, Eliot says, I probably won't even remember. Takes us to Yeats's Caught in That Central Music, All Neglect Monuments of an Aging Intellect. And this is in many ways what postmodernity is all about, as we've seen, the forgetting of the past. Notice here we're going to get this notion of forgiveness in many ways. I mean, what is it Christ says? Forgive them for they know not what they do, as he's on the cross here. Here we are with the idea of forgiveness, and in many ways I like to think of this as, you remember what Emily Dickinson said, judge tenderly of me, she says at the end of This Is My Letter to the World That Never Wrote to Me. I think that Eliot is in many ways doing exactly what Shakespeare does at the conclusion of Tempest with those words of Prospero. Let's take a look now. Last season's fruit. He says, the speaker says, I don't want to rehash what's already been spoken. Many people love these lines at the end of a year. Last season's fruit, we think of Paradise Lost, is eaten, and the full-fed beast shall kick the empty pail, echoing a biblical reference here, right? For last year's words belong to last year's language, and next year's words await another voice. Some have said, after T.S. Eliot, we're still waiting. There's never been a poet like him. But as the passage now presents no hindrance to the spirit unappeased, and Peregrine, the falcon, right? Think about Yeats' second coming. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Between two worlds, I told you at the beginning of I think this is the way to read four quartets, is that tension between two worlds of the political, the literary, or We're getting to that one here. And of course the spiritual as well, which has been almost the entire poem has been about that spiritual tension. Between two worlds become much like each other. So I find words I never thought to speak. Discovery writing, we might say, find words. In streets I never thought I should revisit. When I left my body on a distant shore. And the reason why some people think this is Yeats is because of lines like this. Of course, the distant shore, and therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium, that sailing to Byzantium that we've talked about. Since our concern was speech, and speech impelled us to purify the dialect of the tribe. You could make the argument that this could be Shakespeare speaking. Clearly it could be Yeats speaking, the whole notion that he was an Irish poet, very interested in the whole notion of the dialect of the tribe. Of course, tribe here would be England, Great Britain, those who speak English, we might say. And urge the mind. This is what great poets do, don't they? They purify. Urge the mind to aftersight and foresight. Isn't that what T.S. Eliot has been trying to do throughout this entire poem? Let me disclose, line 131, the gifts reserved for age. I'm going to tell you what it's like to get old. Think about Eliot writing these poems in his mid-50s here now. Think about what it's like to get old, he says. To set a crown upon your lifetime's effort. Well, crown we're going to revisit again in line 261. We think, of course, of the crown of thorns that's put on Christ's head. We think of the crown of laurel leaves that's a part of all poets. All that comes to mind. Okay, what are the things that old age gets you? It's not a pretty picture. Line 133. First, the cold friction of expiring sense without enchantment, offering no promise, but bitter tastelessness of shadow fruit. The Republic 7 in the Cave Allegory. Shadow fruit as body and soul begin to fall asunder. The second coming of Yeats, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Hey, you want to know what's bad about getting old? Physically, the senses start to wane, which is an amazing